Welcome to Your Need to Know. I'm your host, Catherine Reed, and joining me today is Dr. Klara Bilgin of the Virginia International University. She is the Dean of the School of Public and International Affairs. We've spoken to Dr. Bilgin before about many subjects, including Russia and the Russia elections. And it seems like we can't turn on the TV at all or the radio without hearing Russia pretty much on the 24/7 news cycle. But you as an academic approach all of these headlines in a very different way, because for you a lot of this is not a huge surprise at all. It might be to Americans who are like, they're poisoning people in the UK or things like that, but you have studied the politics of Russia for a long time. And so what I hope to do here is help people to understand in a deeper way why we are starting to see some of the movement we're seeing.
Sure. Well, thank you for having me again, and I believe that this may be the second of a large number of installments.
Yes, I think so too.
We are going to see a significant dynamic and a lot of things unraveling very fast, I believe, at least by the end of the year. It would be a really worthy topic to discuss.
Well, so most Americans will tell you that, and we have the attention span of gnats, most of us. So, you know, there was a poisoning in the UK, a former double agent and his daughter. And so 16 countries coordinated to expel Russian diplomats all on the same day, including the US. We had a president who congratulated Putin on his win despite a note in big letters that said, "Do not congratulate." So to me, this almost has a circus effect of like, but that doesn't really tell us how all of this has come about. Like Putin's re-election, you said that he would be re-elected, and you had told us in our last show how you thought long-term that was going to affect relations, not just with us, but with other countries in the world.
Yeah. So I would like to start with the elections. As we all know, Russia had its elections on March 18th. It was to nobody's surprise that Putin won, and he won big. He collected 77% of the vote. The second candidate to follow him was the communist candidate, Dmitry Pavel Grudinin, with 12% of the vote, and then we have the ultranationalist Zhirinovsky with about 5.6% of the vote. So this was a huge win for Putin for a number of reasons. First, this was the biggest history since his running for elections. He had previously run for 3 elections. He had never gotten such a high percentage of the vote, so 77, was a vote that it was good. They wanted to have more than 70. They got 77. Second, the one opposition candidate, and she was seen as a spoiler, but she was seen also as a liberal and opposition, depending on who you ask, Sobchak, didn't get more than 2% of the vote.
Which is very disappointing.
Yes. And the other opposition leader got around 1%, so basically there was no opposition presence or kind of, existence after the elections at all. And then when you look at the person who came second, he is basically a relic of the past, a member of the Communist Party, and Zhirinovsky is a person who has been in the political system for the last 20 years, being very ultranationalist, xenophobic, provocateur. So when you look who are the people who got the first 3 seats in this election, it's kind of really telling us a lot that Russia is not changing. The second reason I saw this as a victory, at least tactical victory for Putin, is that there were talks about possible boycotts or mobilization and protests after the elections organized by the opposition, and those did not materialize. At the same time, there was an expectation just before the elections. The talk was, well, what is going to happen after Putin's last term. He was seen as a lame duck president. The conversation was that the day after the election, most of his inner circle would start juggling for power and influence because they would be preparing for the moment of his succession. Now, interestingly, after the elections, all this rhetoric changed. Now, most of those correspondents and pundits in Russia speak about, well, he's likely to stay. He joked that he's not going to stay by the time he's 100, but the vibe that is coming from Moscow is that he does not intend really to relinquish power. And there may be some other formations, such as State Council, that is set by non-elected officials with him at the helm, that would be there to run Russia even after his last presidential term is over. So it was win in terms of the numbers he got, the highest so far. It was a win in terms of the non-boycott of the elections. I mean, the boycott did not work and there were no protests after the elections. And finally, the fact that now people in Russia see him like he would be here, and we should not be thinking about life after Putin is done.
Well, and it brings a certain amount of stability, knowing that he's going to be there for another 6 years.
Yes. Yes. To the other question of what happened after that with the poisoning of Sergei Skripal and his wife and his daughter Yulia, I think that, I mean, nobody expected that, yes. Depending again on how you count, there have been a number of such very open and brazen murders of, or they may not be seen as murders, but unofficially people recognize those as being
political assassinations.
Political assassinations. And the thing about these political assassinations are that they are very visible. They are usually into your face. They are there to send a message. So this was seen as another one of these political murders that was assassinations that was there to send a message. It is not very clear to who. Is it to those people who work for the intelligence services who may be sharing information? Is it for those who were thinking of deflecting from the Russian regime? But you do that openly in order to use it symbolically. Yes.
Right.
So nobody expected that there would be such a strong reaction from the West. And what we see now is basically that Putin may have overreached, that this time the assassination was done at a particular time when Britain was very sensitive because of the Brexit talks. Right. I think also the fact that we have Theresa May as a prime minister has something to do. It really strikes me how those politicians that are there to take a Putin are women. Yes. So
interesting.
I think this has something to do with it, the fact that Angela Merkel has taken a very strong stance against Putin, and now we have Theresa May. I see female politicians having less of an ego and sometimes more of a courage.
Right.
I may not be very much objective here, but in terms of European politics, this strikes me sometimes to be the case.
Do you think that Theresa May, too, is looking at the fact that the Americans have made much ado about Russian meddling in our elections, and now it looks like with the Cambridge Analytica case that they may have been involved in influencing the Brexit vote? Do you think that has made her more sensitive?
I think absolutely this was the case. The Cambridge Analytica case came exactly in the right time. It kind of reopened the Pandora box of Russian interference, both in American elections and in the Brexit vote. At the same time, there were new revelations coming from our Homeland Security and the FBI that the Russians have been trying to hack and have been successfully hacking our civic infrastructure, including power plants, communication networks, and other civilian infrastructure projects. So this kind of together, within a week, as this all happened within a week, really I think brought the British political circles to a moment that they said we cannot take it anymore. And they were very much surprised that all of a sudden there was a coalition of European countries, 17 EU countries, and other countries that also said, well, enough is enough, we also want to react and basically vent. Most of them, when such kind of political assassinations would happen in their country, previously they would have to deal with this individually, And I think that they have had enough, and this is a good opportunity for countries like Latvia and Estonia and Germany to come out and say, hey, we are standing in solidarity. So in this case, I think that Putin overreached. I think he never expected this to be the case. He knew that Europe has significant military and political power, but Europe never had the will to act against Russia.
Good point.
Now, the question would be, how symbolic is this versus how strategically important it is? Yes. So what if the West expels 120, or now the number of people, surveillance analysts or spies is growing in terms of being expelled from all these countries. Russia usually has much more spies in countries of Western Europe and abroad than other countries have in Russia. So it is very likely that those diplomats would be replaced. And I'm basically debating to what extent this is a long-term strategy. Now, a much more beneficial long-term strategy would be if we impose additional sanctions. And thinking about London, well, London is the place where most of the Russian oligarchs who break up with the regime or who are still friendly with the regime come to basically harbor their money, to do investment, and to have a kind of a free life. As London is and Britain is the place where there are much less regulations of you taking, just to say it outright, dirty money and reinvesting them and using them. And that's why we have so many of the Russian oligarchs being there. It would be much more difficult to happen in the US, although it is happening also in the US. So I was thinking, if Britain wants to send a stronger message, it would be, well, you know, we are seriously going to go after this money, and especially the ones that are directly related to Putin. If they do that, however, they may disrupt, you know, their real estate market. They may disrupt the operations of a number of big banks in London City. So they're careful not to do it. But it would be a more winning strategy to go directly after the interests of the Russian oligarchs, who then are going to impose pressure on Putin. Because diplomats would go back, they would be you know, sent somewhere else. They are not going to impose pressure on Putin. The oligarchs and their interests and their networks are the ones that can impose pressure on the regime to do something different.
Well, you make a very good point, because follow the money has always been the advice, whether it's international politics or domestic politics. It's about following the money. And you're right, sanctions have been discussed, but I think your approach makes a lot more sense because you're targeting a specific group of people in a very specific place.
Yes.
When we come back from our break, we are going to be talking again about Russia.
Na 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 na, I love you so. I love you, I love you. La 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 la, la 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 la.
We're here.
Yay!
It's a short drive from your neighborhood to your naturehood. To find a neighborhood park or green space near you, visit discovertheforest.org.
Hey, you.
Yeah, you. Getting that college education, what are you gonna do? Graduate and take some office job? Be like everybody else?
Or will you dare do something different?
Like, be a teacher. You could be my teacher. You got the skills.
The smarts?
Yes, you. You could be the teacher I never forget.
That would be cool.
Does that corporate job even have recess? What are you gonna make of yourself?
What are you going to make of me?
Welcome back to Your Need to Know. Today we are talking about the follow-up to the Russian elections and what we can expect from President Vladimir Putin in his next 6-year term. Joining me today is Dr. Klara Bilgin from the Virginia International University. And when we went to break, we were talking about some of the international pressures to be exerted upon Putin. But in a week that was really terrible for him globally, there was also a very tragic fire in Siberia that came about the same day that all of these diplomats were expelled all over the world. What is the significance and what should we understand about this fire that happened in Siberia and Putin's response to it?
So I take the fire to be a little bit of a prototypical case. It was in the city of Keremovo. It was on a Sunday when most of the kids and their parents of this small place were playing in the mall, in the theater, in the coffee shop, and kind of enjoying themselves. And the thing about the fire is that there were 64 victims, and many of those victims could have been saved if the conditions in this place were different, if the exit doors were not blocked, if the alarm was switched on rather than switched off by the guard, if there was a protocol and an understanding what to do by the emergency services. So the thing is that this is not the first fire in Russia that has such a dimension. It is not the first emergency which would have more victims than the current situation would necessitate because of what Putin would say is a criminal negligence. So what I saw in this fire is first this really criminal negligence of the people who run the infrastructure and this particular mall, and the fact that they are not accountable to anyone. Usually this would be oligarchs or rich people who would be very close with the political elite, and they would create those infrastructures, but they would not be accountable of what happens to people within these infrastructures. The second thing that was really particularly striking was the reaction of the authorities. The day after the fire, or late in the same day, people spontaneously started to gather in the center of the place and basically to protest and say, look what happened, how is this possible in this country? And then the governor of the area came, and instead of apologizing, instead of being humble, instead of being tolerant, understanding, compassionate, he basically attacked the protesters. And these are the parents of those who have passed away. These are people who have just lost their family. And he said, he basically attacked them and saying that those are not the dead of the relatives of the dead, those are troublemakers. Yes. Wow. And there was a guy who was very upset who said, I just have lost my children and my wife. He lost, I believe, 3 or 4 members of his family, and he was shaking and he was saying, look what happened. And the governor basically told him that he is hyping himself up. Yes. And then when he apologized, the next day Putin came and said that, this is really criminal negligence. He showed some compassion, some understanding, and the governor apologized to Putin, but he never apologized to the parents and the relatives of that, basically lost their children and lost parts of their family in this awful and terrible fire. So this is to show you the governor is elected by Putin. He's chosen by Putin. He's not elected by the constituents. He's not elected by the people. He does not feel responsible to the people. He does not feel connection to the people. And this creates a situation in which the state is like a it's like a stepmother to you. Yes, there is no mechanism of accountability. There is no mechanism of, rectifying things. I don't think that this fire would teach the local authorities what to change. And I don't believe that it would introduce any change. So this is to show us how these kind of authoritarian states react when something like this happens. They never learn from it, and they penalize the people who are already, victimized by the tragedy. But the second thing that it also shows is that this is the underbelly of these authoritarian regimes, and for Russia very much. The corruption that leads to lack of responsibility, criminal negligence, super arrogance is something that is, you can see it in every instance in authoritarian regimes and very much in Russia. And this irritates people. Yes, people are supporting Putin because of his foreign policy expansion and so on. But on a day-to-day basis, they have to live in pretty difficult circumstances. And while 10 years ago, Putin was very mighty and powerful because the oil prices reached 140, 150 per barrel, in the last years, 2-3 years, they have basically halved. So a lot of what economically was happening to produce, expansion of the wealth in Turkey, now it is shrinking. And when this is happening on top of this criminal negligence, this is a big irritant for people. I mean, it makes everybody's life very difficult.
But in an authoritarian state, how likely is it that people will push back? What avenues exist for people who don't like the governor or who think that it's a matter of criminal negligence and there's no accountability? And, what is the appetite for Russians to actually try to do something about their, what we would call kitchen table issues in their own communities?
Well, there has not been a unified or structured pushback. They are protests here and there. They're usually localized. There is a reaction to brazen indignities or brazen acts of violence, or some new law that would pass. For example, just a week before that, there was reaction by the parents of kids who were poisoned in a kind of chemical, in a chemically polluted area. They really stood up and started speaking about this particular case. But this is not an organized opposition that is proactive, and there is no such really outside
right.
of Navalny and his efforts. But I believe that if they are opposition candidates to run for office in the future, for elections, local elections, city elections, state elections, I believe that Russians down the line would start voting for them again. Yes. Currently, it is such the case is that they really associate themselves so strongly with the resurgence of Putin's Russia and with the state. People feel so attached to the state that they support Putin. That's true because they don't see an alternative, right. And because they don't think that somebody else would be able to solve their daily issues.
Because they see him as a strong leader. I mean, I think that's a lot of it. And it's also about the economy. It's always about the economy. As long as the economy hasn't faltered, I can imagine there's not a huge appetite for people to push back.
So I kind of see Putin differently from outside. And I think we should look here at the trajectory of power creation. Since he became a prime minister in August of 1999 and then a president in 2000, and up to now, yes, 18 years. And when I think about him, recently I wanted to write an article called The Price of Putin, and basically see how many people's lives and suffering can be attributed directly to his foreign policy in these 18 years. And I thought that it would be a much larger count than what we attribute to Milosevic during the Balkan Wars, a person that we called the butcher of the Balkans. Right. Yes. And in these 18 years, I believe that by trying to recreate Russia or the Soviet Union, expand Russia's power, Putin had created a concentric circles of Russian influence that are generally very negative for those countries and those populations that they affect. And with time, these concentric circles started with the former areas of the Soviet Union, such as Chechnya, then the borders of what is today Russia, such as, let's say, Transnistria, Ossetia, South Ossetia, Abkhazia, then reached Eastern Europe, then reached Western Europe, and lately, in the last 3-4 years, is reaching the West. And this week, we're talking about Russia's intervention in the elections in Latin America. So what we can see in terms of the evolution of Putin and the power that he yields, not only in Russia, I think that by the end of the first century of the first 10 years of this century, putting concentrated power domestically. By 2008, when he passed the president post to Medvedev, he already had domestic power under control. And when he came back in 2012, he kind of really centralized through the Siloviki structures and putting the oligarchs under his control, every single domestic structure under him. And he took care of the opposition and opposition outlets. So in 2012, he was ready to basically expand and to take over foreign governments and to put strategic effort and finances influencing Eastern Europe, beyond Eastern Europe, Western Europe, and the US. And it was very interesting to hear what made him to do this jump from the post-Soviet space or the Russian space into a larger space. And there are a number of accounts that said that one thing that affected him, his psyche profoundly, was the killing of Muammar Gaddafi in Libya. And that he was obsessed watching the demise of Gaddafi. And he was saying, the West is coming after me. Basically, I have to prevent it. So this was one of the trigger points that he thought that what happened to Gaddafi and the way he was killed and regime change happened in Libya can happen to him in Russia. And the second point was the revelation of the Panama Papers.
Ah, yes, the Panama Papers.
Panama Papers, in which basically it came out that he's a super rich man. Today we're talking, Bloomberg News said that he may be the richest person on earth with $200 billion stashed all around the world. And that came and kind of started to nag his legitimacy domestically.
So, I mean, I think that's a very an interesting dynamic, and you brought a very interesting perspective that Americans have not considered or thought about as far as how the Russian people view the elections of Vladimir Putin. So I just want to say thank you so much for having been here. I expect that we're going to have you on the show frequently because you have so much as far as your position as Dean of Public and International Affairs at Virginia International University. You bring a wealth of knowledge and experience. So thank you very much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me.